Hi there. Before we do anything else, I just want to do an acknowledgement of country. So before I even introduce myself, so we are on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I want to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and actually acknowledge that these are the first scientists and artists of this land. So it's extraordinary to be able to continue that tradition on this land and hopefully integrate some of those ideas as we move forward into the future. So my name is Stephen Dover. I have a pseudonym. I go AKA Sid Sledge. And I am basically hosting this conversation between Michael Gillings and Laura Jade, scientist and artist. And, you know, I'm meant to be a moderator, but as my wife says, I like to be part of the conversation. So I'm a terrible moderator and I will participate in the conversation. My background is I started off being a scientist and I moved over to the arts about 5 years ago. And the reason I became a scientist was when I was a child, I'll try and move through this quickly. I grew up in South Africa, and I think this is relevant because South Africa, I think we all know, was under very strict apartheid, very controlled society. Because it was best that we didn't know the truth of the situation. So there wasn't much thinking and freedom of thought, and everything was essentially as it was told to you. Religious conservatism, social conservatism. And I remember when I turned 13, I was given this book by David Attenborough, Life on Earth. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. And in it, it had pictures of what the Earth looked like 300 million years ago. And for somebody who was raised to believe that the Earth was 6,000 years old and that nothing interesting was happening around you, just behave yourself and stay straight, that was, it was like my mind exploded. And it was like such a revelation. It was almost like a religious experience. And I decided I had to devote the rest of my life to understanding and knowing that what is immediately in front of my face is not as the world is. It's a far more interesting place than that. So that led me down this pathway to science. And you know, I worked as a scientist for a while. I loved science, but I found that I wasn't getting the meaning out of it. I was a geneticist. And so when I moved to Australia, I just called myself an artist, thus the Sid Sledge. And I was hoping to forget about science entirely. But you know, after practicing as an artist for a few years, just color and line and trying to understand those ideas, I had a bit of an epiphany where I was doing some sketch doodling. I wasn't thinking, and these drawings came out. We're all about ideas, all about science, all about that mystery that I experienced as a child, that feeling. And so from that moment forth, I decided I was going to devote the rest of my life to trying to understand that, trying to understand the world through this, trying to understand the science that I loved through art. And I made a decision to work as much as I can with other scientists. So I did that for years, and I must acknowledge the CSIRO here, Linfield, because they've allowed me to test some of those ideas over the last few years, which has been an amazing opportunity. And what I've come to now in the last year is that, yes, there's the work I do, but there's this huge investigation in the arts at that interface of science. And I want to, and I thought it would really be interesting to have conversations where these really interesting artists are talking to scientists all over the place to try and actually take our culture forward. Because, you know, scientists, we need both to move our culture forward as far as I'm concerned. I think most people would agree with that. We're at a place in our history and our evolution where we need to break down barriers. We need to understand each other better. We need to understand how our systems work. And we need to bring intuition back into the game. We need to bring emotion back into the sciences. Scientists can go down these wormholes, and that's how science works. You dig deep into a problem. Sometimes you lose sight maybe of the bigger picture, and artists are great at hovering over that, asking the questions about the context of these things and opening up these cracks of it. And so that's really why we are here today, because I have with me a scientist and an artist, and I think two leaders in their field, who are both scientists and artists. So it's really exciting for me to have people like this to actually ask these really interesting questions about what can art do for science. This is National Science Week, so that's a big part of it. And also, how can we move the culture forward? How can we move our society forward? I've been really lucky to have done a couple of these other conversations over the last few days, and I've been blown away because the answers are not obvious. but there's beautiful discussions that can happen that can slowly open up these cracks. So I think the thing to say about Michael is that, you can correct me if you're wrong, Michael, you don't really think there's much distinction between arts and science. We'll explore that in a moment. And Laura, you've got the most fascinating path that you followed to become the artist that you are. So these are some things we're going to touch on. But I think just to kick off, Michael, given that you come from a family of artists and scientists, where does the art sit with you, and what impact has it actually had on you as a scientist? And
well, as you say, Steve, I don't see that there's much difference between art and science at all. Both are about observing the world, about asking questions, being imaginative about the answers and the way that you can present those answers. And I really don't think that there's as much difference in the activities, or even potentially the characteristics of scientists and artists. The best scientists and the best artists both have characteristics of imagination, playfulness, curiosity. I just was struck by one thing that you said earlier about drilling down as a scientist. So when I'm talking to my students, I say, okay.
Oh, it's frozen. Damn. Gally, you want to see the connections? Just I've lost the connection.
Only a very narrow borehole running down. And what you should strive to do as you mature as a scientist is what I call T-shaped thinking. So you have the depth of knowledge in your specific area or multiple areas, but you have an overarching, as you say, synoptic view of everything else. Because if your one thing is the spore size of a particular fungal genus, there's only 6 people on the planet you can talk to. And so, you need to have this breadth across the top. You need to be kind of a Renaissance person, if that makes sense, in order to make a big impact and communicate.
I think that's such a great way to put it, and it's quite hard to do though. You have to be open. And do you think that's part of who you are, or do you see that in a lot of scientists around you that you've worked with, or do you think it's something about you that's allowed this wider?
That's a good question. I think that the best scientists, and certainly the best communicators, have an enormously wide general knowledge and can draw connections between different parts of the world. So you can show people that this particular thing over here actually has relevance to these other things over here. And the only way you can do that is by knowing about the existence of all of that diversity.
That's the beauty of patterns.
Look, there are scientists who are very good at just drilling down and being obsessive about one particular subject. There's no doubt about that. But that work takes a long time to permeate into the culture of humanity, because very few people understand it. And I think you're much better off. I could choose multiple ways of making a living, and I'd be happy in many of them, because I'm interested in everything pretty much. And I think that artists are interested in everything as well. So I don't know, Jade. Laura, what do you think?
I think that's the one thing that characterizes my trajectory through art and science, is really that everything's linked by this supreme curiosity for things, and as well as a love of light, because I predominantly work with light. And so my journey really has been a bit windy in a sense, how I've come from art to science and then back to art again. I actually started in painting 15 years ago, and it was there that my love of light began to emerge, and I wanted to paint light, in portraits of friends that I would sort of get them to hold lamps under their faces so I could capture light, you know, playing out on their face. And you know, it requires great powers of observation to kind of capture those things in art. And that, you know, that's sort of one little link between science, is this sort of, the artist also needs a really keen eye to observe these things. And, you know, I was really trying to capture masterpieces like Caravaggio or Rembrandt or something, and the quality of light in there was captivating to me. And so light was really something that began when I was painting. But I ended up moving to Europe for 2 years after that degree, and it was in Europe that I kind of had a revelation that changed my trajectory. And you know, I was visiting all the museums and galleries looking at all these paintings, but I was also visiting the science museums and the natural history museums, and I found them just as beautiful as the art galleries. I was absolutely transfixed by these strange specimens in glass cabinets. And, you know, I realized that I'd become really transfixed with a particular period in history as well, and that was the Renaissance. And so, like, going to Europe is kind of like having a bath in the Renaissance. You kind of just dunk yourself in, and it's kind of apparent in the architecture and in the literature all around you. So I really started to formulate my own values about art and science by being immersed in this Renaissance sort of period when I was traveling in Europe. And when I came back to Australia, I sort of began questioning my role as an artist, and I began thinking that actually, to make a contribution to society, maybe science is better. Maybe science is the way to do it, because science has facts and it has boundaries. You know, as an artist, it's kind of a very meandering existence, and you don't have a structure necessarily. You have to create one for yourself. And I was very young then, and I didn't really know how to do that. So I actually enrolled in a biology degree at Macquarie University, where Michael's working. And so I spent an amazing 2 years just diving into biology and getting extremely distracted by the beauty of things. And, you know, I think artists are good networkers, because I was just fascinated, and I just talked to everybody. I just met everyone. I talked to everyone from different departments, and I was really inspired also by the idea of science communication and the importance of science communication. And so this led me to change my trajectory again to study museum studies, because I thought, especially from Europe, that museums were the sort of powerhouse of thought of art and science coming together. And I thought, museums is where it's at. This is where I need to be. And so I studied museum studies and curation. But I didn't quite find my groove there. It was a bit dusty, the degree, in a sense. You know, I was learning how to kind of catalogue things, and I was like, this is not quite what I wanted to be doing. So while I was studying my curation degree, this was at Sydney Uni, I actually met an ichthyologist, and he's a fish scientist. And so he actually invited me to do some scientific drawings of his fish. And this was kind of interesting to me, because this is the traditional cross-section of art and science in a way, was that art was to capture and illustrate science in a really precise way. Yeah. So I spent 6 months in a basement drawing fish with him and trying to capture the sort of little tiny bone structures in the tails. And so that was interesting, but, you know, that wasn't quite me either, because I wanted to elaborate on the fish tails, and you're not allowed to do that when you're trying to draw them for science papers. So it was at that time that I actually went to a conference, and this is what really changed my life in a sense, was this conference it was the ICEA conference, which is the International Symposium of Electronic Arts. And it was there that I went to talks about bioart, about robotics, about new media art, you know, art as activism, all of these sort of cross-section, multidisciplinary ideas kind of in a big melting pot. And it just blew my mind. And I realized that this was the arena where I could do both things. You know, this was my world and it was my people. And so I'd sort of found my community in a sense. And it was at that conference that I met Michael Day, who's the leader of the Masters of Lighting Design at UTS. And we chatted, and he invited me to join his master's course. And so I jumped ship again started a different degree in lighting and technology. And, you know, it was at UTS that really my world blew open, and I realized that all of those things I'd been interested in biology, in light, in science, in museums, and art could finally coalesce and kind of be unified. And yeah, so that was kind of my journey into the artist that I am today. And really, it's interesting that now I think universities are opening up more to allow for multidisciplinary people with interests like me to do both things, you know. But when I was studying, and it was only sort of 10 years ago, a bit less than 10 years ago, it wasn't as available. And so I had to kind of like pick and choose the things I wanted to learn with my own, you know, following my own appetites in a way.
So Laura and Steve, I want to ask you something, but just before I do that, I just want to comment on the end of what you just said, Laura, which is about the reunification of all of these separate disciplines, because C.P. Snow, he did a thing called the Reed Lecture in 1959, and he talked about the two cultures of humanities, of people, arts and sciences. And he was saying, you know, there's a gulf between these two, and the inability for us to bridge that gulf lies at the heart of many of the problems that we have dealing with critical issues that humans face.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But now even more so, there's not just one gulf, there's a gulf between every single little discipline, because everything is so specialized. And so what we really need now are people who are synoptic, who can transcend all of these disciplines and don't necessarily have to be an expert in any of them.
Totally, yeah. I think
they can step back and see the pattern, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Because I realized, you know, I sort of gave a good thought to being a scientist, but I realized that art actually provides me the greatest freedom to explore all aspects of human thought and knowledge, because it, you know, it allows you to dive deeply, but it also allows you to swim sideways between all of those silos of knowledge. And it, you know, allows you to build bridges, I guess, between all those disparate thoughts. And, you know, in that sense, this resurgence of this more holistic way of thinking, I think maybe there's more support behind it now, because we're realizing that you need to think like that to tackle complex problems.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Almost
so the other thing oh, sorry, Steve.
No, I was going to just comment that it's almost an interesting thing, because it's like a natural progression. Like we must have started out as a simple organism. I mean, a simple, you know, human who had to create things, build things. I mean, we had to be expansive in the way we imagined and then make things. But then that just kind of slowly settled out into silos, into groups. So it's almost like a differentiated organism, you know, with its eye and its nose. But, you know, as anyone who's studied complex biology, there's got to be crosstalk. There's got to be something that ties it together. And it's almost like those nerves have been severed. And so what we're talking about here is how do we actually bring those things back? I've actually, can I read a comment? There's a question, I think it might be one of your students, Michael.
Let me have a look.
Emily McIntyre. Emily, I agree with what you are both saying about unifications. In my last semester at uni, I did a Bio 101 with Michael, major, and I felt so at home and valued and loved learning with you. There's some nice feedback.
Oh, thank you, Emily. That is so nice. And I hope that, I'm glad Emily said that. It makes me very happy, because I take a lot of time to try and introduce examples from music, literature, art into the teaching of what could be just a human biology course. But when you introduce references from elsewhere in people's lives, it resonates with them more. And it actually, even though, you know, Andy Warhol's soup can has nothing to do with the origin of life, nevertheless, it resonates as a prebiotic soup, right?
Yeah.
And this comes back to something I wanted to ask both you, Steve, and Laura about ways of seeing. So when Laura was talking about the museums and the meticulous illustration, I think back to Haeckel, Die Kunst die Natur, is that what it's called? Where Haeckel did biologically accurate drawings, but they're supremely beautiful works of art as well.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to ask about,
slightly.
he did primp them a little bit, yes. But what I wanted to ask about was the fact that when you're representing something, you don't necessarily have to represent it as it is. You can represent its essence in some way, and it tells you more about the thing. For instance, in my head, I've got this image of a jellyfish, you know, a Haeckel-like jellyfish. But then if you think about doing that in a watercolor with a misty kind of diaphanous, it tells you something about the jellyfish that isn't actually conveyed in the, you know, accurate drawing with all of the bits. So I wanted to ask both of you about how you approach that, you know, representation of things that are not as they actually are in life.
Well, if I may respond first, Laura, what you talk about, I think it's got, and this is something it's slowly unfolding for me, is that to understand something, you know, the way a scientist understands is one way. You measure, you kind of have to, the language is contracted. It's like analyzed, categorized. The ability of an artist to expand. And there's an idea in art called structural intuition. Is that something that's familiar to you? Where, you know,
No.
Scientists measure, and that's an important way to see patterns. But there's much more subtle, intuitive patterning happening out there that are beyond the ordinary way that we measure. And the way that humans are able to gain access to their world, just to how they can live and be in the world, they have to have some way of getting the information that's out there through themselves and then expressed in some kind of way, be it words, be it language, be it feelings. And that's kind of what you're talking about with your watercolor, the diaphanous. It's like we have to have other ways. It's the only way we can understand anything really is if we have other ways to access it. Quantum mechanics is a great example. Nobody understands quantum mechanics. And we've got all these metaphors, but it's the artists who are going to give us the structural intuition, the intuition to get a sense of this world that's never been available to us.
I was going to, just before Laura responds, it just came to me as well about the pictures of bison in the Lascaux caves, which are not representational of the anatomy, but you look at it and it captures the movement, the musculature, the dynamism, and everything is there to convey exactly that animal, even though it's not real. It's not a representation of the thing. So that's the kind of, you know, I'm trying to understand how you get to that. Sorry, Laura, I interrupted.
Oh no, I think like it's all true what you're saying. You know, artists and myself in particular, we're kind of obsessed with visualizing the invisible. It's like the sort of tacit knowledge that isn't able to put into words. And so, you know, experiencing art kind of nourishes our psychological needs because it provides a kind of intrinsic pleasure, I think, to have a way of like a sensory anchor to our thoughts and emotions, you know, that it isn't word-based and it isn't objective necessarily or rational. So for me, I think it's very hard to quantify the value of art precisely because of this, because its impact can be so subtle and it can even be subconscious, and you might not even know how it shifted your thoughts. You know, you might encounter a work of art and it's made an imprint on your mind, just like how you're imprinting on your students, you know, by giving them so much diversity of thought. It might just go in and they don't really realize it, but something has shifted that might be tangible later on down the track. And so like those eureka moments that happen for scientists and artists are usually not just spontaneous. They're usually because we've absorbed so many sort of implicit, invisible things that have allowed ideas to fall into place. And so I think art provides that value, really.
Laura, can I use that as a way to enter one of your artworks, right? Because what you just said there, And I'm going to read a quote because your work, we haven't really spoken about what you actually made. And there's a quote from the paper you wrote describing it. I'm going to read this quote, if you'll just forgive me. And you're talking about your interactive artwork, and then I'd like you to talk to that, because I think it mirrors what you've just said now. Interactive art as a mirror with a shifting reflection. These transformed reflections are a dialogue between the self and the world beyond. Does this sound familiar? Good.
Yeah, it's a quote from David Rockaby.
That's right, yes. And my favorite line that you quoted is, the echo operates like a wayward loop of consciousness through which one's image of oneself and one's relationship to the world can be examined, questioned, and transformed. I thought the way that you use that, and the way it talked to your work, I'd love to hear about, I mean, I'm referring now to Brainlight, but you can use it to talk to other works of yours, because I think it'd be good for the viewers, and welcome viewers. I haven't actually formally welcomed you to the session, so my apologies for that. It's amazing to have you here, and I hope you're enjoying the session. But now Laura's going to tell us a little bit about her work and how it can transform us.
All right, well, let me share my screen with you just very quickly so you can have an image of what I'm talking about. Is it this one? Oh. Okay. What are you guys seeing now? Are you seeing?
I'm seeing Word document.
Word document.
Oh no.
Maybe. Why don't you start talking? Describe just what it is, because I think it's
okay. All right.
Description. I'll try and find it on the internet, or maybe to describe what it is.
I think I've got it.
Oh, here we go. That's it.
Wonderful.
All right. Okay, so Brainlight is an artwork that I made at the end of my degree at UTS, and so it uses EEG technology, which is an electroencephalograph, one of these things, and it reads the electrical activity of your mind, and it transmits that into colored light inside an artwork. And so what happens is it's a live feedback loop of what your thoughts are doing, you know, represented in the artwork as light, which then influences your thoughts, and it becomes this sort of recursive interaction, which is called neurofeedback. And so what the work really is looking at is, it's taking a neurofeedback therapy, which is usually something that's in a clinical setting, and it's putting it in an artistic setting in a gallery. So people can really explore what neurofeedback is. And what it is, it really is a way to try and understand your own mind or your own consciousness and your own thoughts, and to gain some control over them. So if you've got a visual representation of something that's invisible, like your mind, you can start to work with that. You know, a lot of people think they might be really calm, but when you actually have a look inside their brain, maybe they're just buzzing like, you know, like crazy. So it gives you a sort of tangible anchor to meet your own mind externally and have it.
So Laura, maybe you could remind us about what the 3 different colors represent in terms of brainwaves. Oh, you're about to do that. Okay, sorry.
Oh no, I've just got the slides here, so
yeah,
I can sort of shoot around. But so yeah, I was interested in communicating with color and communicating with light, and there are 3 frequency states that the brain can show. The first one is theta, which is green, and that's when you're in a sort of resting state, not thinking too hard, you're kind of just chilling. It's also a state that's been associated with creativity and creative thought, when you're kind of in that flow state. The next color is blue, and that's alpha. So alpha waves you get when you're calm and meditative and relaxed. So that's like when you're closing your eyes and you're deep breathing, you can bring on an alpha state. And the third color is red, and that's when you're excited or stressed. So that's when the brain is completely active. You are doing a maths problem, or you're really emotional or really excited or really frustrated with something. So the brain is working on overdrive. So what happens when someone puts the headset on is that all these colors kind of create patterns of their own thinking, and we can start to work, I start to work with them to try and get them to each different state depending on sort of their memories or emotions or thought processes. And, you know, we can try to meditate, or we can try to play games or things like that. So it sets up a kind of playful exercise to explore their own brain.
Have you engaged this work with neuroscientists who are trying to understand like complex questions like consciousness or, you know?
I actually had, I wonder if I've got a slide here, but oh yeah, here it is. So I've had a funny experience where I was actually invited to show, I've got a mini brain, and I took the mini brain on a tour around Europe to do different festivals. And while I was over there, I was in Israel, and I got invited to the Technion, the Institute of Technology, to meet this guy, which is Avi Skroder, and he's actually a nanoscientist. And he found out about the brain through word of mouth somehow, and he wanted me to bring it in to show his research team. And I was a bit like, well, I don't know anything really about nanoscience, although I'm very curious. So I brought the brain in, and his thinking, you know, and this is an example of a scientist who is just like thinking way outside the box, like more like outside the planet. His thinking was that in his particular nanotechnology, which he does nanotechnology for medicine, he uses radio waves and ultrasound to move nanoparticles around the body and to get them to provide medication. So just by using particular frequencies, he can use these micro drugs to kind of get diagnoses of things, but also to give medicine. And so he was thinking, what would happen if you could use your own brain to medicate yourself with these nanoparticles? Could you think or harness certain frequencies of the mind that could enact these drugs to work? And so he was curious in my work because it was sort of using the mind to get certain colors, and he wanted his research team to kind of think, how could they maybe harness this in their own research? And it was, I mean, it's very, very forward thinking. It's not something that would be accessible tomorrow, but it's very interesting, isn't it? And that was sort of an interesting way that art could feed into their research, just to allow them to shift thinking in certain ways. And I've also sent a brain over to this guy who's, this is a Romanian neuroscientist, and he contacted me saying he was interested in my work, and he sent me all these images of himself chopping up brains, you know, to kind of prove how much he was into brains. I thought he was really quite a cool, peculiar guy, and so we got chatting, and he ended up commissioning a mini brain, and I sent it over to Romania, and he uses it now at conferences and to educate students about the brain.
So Laura, can I, so Steve was asking about whether brain light's been used by neuroscientists, right? But my question would be the opposite of that, is has brain light been thought about by philosophers? And the reason for this is because it directly addresses something that I don't know a lot about, but, you know, I have enough to be dangerous, and that's phenomenology. Okay, so phenomenology is the idea that none of us know what anyone else is experiencing. And the classic example is pain. If you've never had a headache, well, actually, the classic example is period pain. Men cannot understand what it is like because they have never had it and never will. Okay, so it's impossible for men to understand that. Think about this, though. What you've shown us is three almost pure ways of thinking, alpha, beta, theta, right? What if you had never had one of those kinds of thinking? So you never understand what it was like to be excited or to be calm or to be introspective. The only way that two people can agree on what the feeling is like is for them both to get attached to the machine and enter a state where the brain is all green. And then they go, oh, that's what that's like. Now I am sharing that particular mental state with you, and I know exactly what you are feeling when the brain light is green, because now I've experienced it. And so it seems to me that this is a way, as you say, of bringing into the light things that are indefinable, things that are evanescent, things that are completely without words to describe what they are.
Totally.
And it's a really interesting, and I'm surprised that you know, philosophers have not kind of jumped on this and gone, whoa, this is a really interesting tool. Let's use it for something.
Well, I mean, I think there is work happening in this area. There's definitely other people using EEGs for artistic purposes, you know, and the article that I wrote was part of a book that just looks at people who are just doing that. It's a very niche community, but, you know, there is a community happening out there. And one of the interesting things I think is that brain activity, as opposed to like respiration or heart activity, you can't actually feel it in your body. You can't sense it, you can't feel it. And so having an artistic representation of it does make it tangible for people to start to have these questions, or to philosophize, I guess, about the nature of the mind and consciousness.
And to train themselves to see what a particular set of brainwaves feels like. Because, you know, we all know what it's like to run up a flight of stairs and to be breathing hard, and, you know what it's like. But particular, as you say, you can't feel what your brain is doing. And actually, you know, matching up the feeling that you have with the physical activity is pretty much impossible, except if you use something like Brainlight or an EEG feedback machine, which is awesome. So much fun.
I guess there is a role, and this happens in all of art as well, where art can teach you about your own emotions. You know, we don't understand ourselves all the time. That's why we go to psychologists and things, but art can also provide that by sort of reflecting our own emotions back at us, so we can dig into them a bit to understand ourselves. And on a bigger level, that's how we understand ourselves collectively as a humanity, through art. And I know science can tell us a lot about ourselves as well, but, you know, if you imagine ourselves now, maybe we all go to ruins and we're all buried, and a future civilization is digging up the bits and pieces. What would we look for to understand ourselves? And we'd look to our culture and our art, I think, to really tell us those sort of hard to define qualities about us, how we felt, how we experienced the world, and what we hoped and desired for. So, you know,
sorry to interrupt. There's a question. Again, the attendees, please feel free to post questions. There's a question now from a philosopher. Okay, here's a question from a philosopher, all right?
So this is Tibor, right? And you're absolutely right, Tibor, that there's no way of telling that the experience is the same. I mean, this is called qualia, is it? So for instance, I often say to people that the existence of synesthesia, which is where senses bleed in one into the other, right? So that, you know, the smell of peppermint and the color red are inextricably associated. You know, there's no reason when I look at a blue color that if someone else was to jump into my brain, they might recognize that neural feedback as being a sharp stick sticking into their knee or something, because we have representations of the outside world that we can never communicate to anyone else, and we actually don't know how anyone else experiences the outside world. All we can say is there potentially is an outside world that everyone is experiencing. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Tibor, and you know, so
it's unknowable. It's totally unknowable.
Here's a question, if I may, and it might be it might not make any sense, but I hope it does. Does your brain light learn? Is there any learning that happens? We're learning, but is there learning going on in the machine, like evolution?
Well, I mean, there's a few ways of answering this question, because the EEG, like as a technology, the EEG headset has the potential to learn. So it's got machine learning. So you can put the headset on and train it to your own thoughts, and it will get better at picking up those thoughts. And you can program the headset to have an action based on those thoughts. So it's being used at the moment for like remote control wheelchairs for people who can't move or speak, and they can think a certain thought like Rubik's Cube, something quite obscure, and the brain will know what that frequency means, move right or move left. So you can train it to learn your own brain, but I don't do that in Brainlight because I want to work with lots of different people, and I don't want to just train it to one mind. I want to sort of have it accessible for, I guess, more audiences. So what the evolution and learning really comes from the audience and how they work with the brain.
And just in terms of your artistic process, so when you conceived Brainlight, did you already have in mind that it would be of value as something that would benefit people, or did that emerge? So you just wanted to make this brain that could respond to your thoughts, and then you discovered that it had this amazing...
I think my side is like, I mean, it was purely selfishness. I just wanted to do it for myself.
I would hope that it is. I think that's the purest thing. You know, if you decide, I want to make an important artwork that makes people's lives better, you're probably a narcissist or a megalomaniac.
Yeah, you know, that sort of thinking can be quite limiting, because then you put so much pressure on yourself to benefit humanity that you just...
And there's that. And Michael, look, you know, you're an artist too, okay? So you don't just, I mean, you seem to, you know, you really do seem to encompass the whole sort of spectrum of art and science. Do you want to talk a little bit about your process? But I'm really curious how it, and I think you've gone there, like how it informs you as a scientist. Like, you know, you've probably already gone there, but is that something you'd like to elaborate on? Because you also make quite interesting artworks yourself.
So there's a couple of things here, a couple of themes. Excuse me. The first of these is ephemeral art. So ephemeral art was pioneered by Andy Goldsworthy. To give you an idea, I mean, my favorite Andy Goldsworthy pieces are, okay, it starts to rain, so he lies down on the pavement and he waits until it stops raining, and then he stands up and walks away. And what you're left with is a man-shaped silhouette dry patch on the ground. Now, the reason that is so cool is because, firstly, he walks away from it and takes no credit for it at all. And the second thing is that it's there to surprise the viewer, for someone to stumble upon this and go, what the hell? How did this happen? And so my ephemeral art is largely, you know, natural materials arranged into, you know, specific patterns that, where it's possible for them to arise spontaneously, but the likelihood of that happening is vanishingly small. So for instance, you know, a spiral of raked leaves, or a gradation of colored flowers running out, or things in positions where they shouldn't be. You know, you can just move things and put them somewhere and arrange them in a repeating pattern or something like that. And the idea, at least from my perspective about this, is about entropy, is about the fact that, you know, everything kind of decays and runs away. So when you come across something like this, you realize it must have been constructed. Now that kind of runs counter to biology, where complexity arises as a consequence of natural processes. So, you know, I want people to think about those two things, about the fact that life can become more and more complex and more ordered, and Steve, your artwork reflects this. You know, it's repeating patterns over and over again that you put together, and something bigger comes out of arranging small units together, right? And that's essentially what living things are. So that's one aspect of what I do. The other one is recycling, is taking found objects that are often discarded, they're rubbish, collecting them together and making something useful or valuable out of them. So I mainly work in metal and glass and ceramics and things like that. My sister, who's a sculptor, works in plastic. So if you just excuse me for 1 minute, I will be back. I should have done this beforehand.
This is what is great about a live conversation. You don't know where it's going to go, and you don't know where Michael's going to go. So
this is one of her sculptures.
Oh wow!
Right?
Awesome.
It's a dodo, and it's made completely out of packing tape.
Yeah.
plastic packing tape, film, discarded 35mm film. That, I think, is a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle carapace. And so, you know, the fact that she can construct a life-size, anatomically accurate representation of a dodo, to me, makes a comment on extinction at the same time as constructing the comment out of an agent of extinction, which is the plastic crisis that faces the world today. So to me, you know, like Laura was saying before, you know, an artwork, when you look at it, yes, it's a plastic bird, right? Made out of bits. But when you start to think about the potential meanings and the metaphors and the nuances of how it works, that is what, and it takes you to places that you haven't been before. Art and science both do that. They both take you to realizations and epiphanies. And Laura said it multiple times, you know, I had this epiphany about something, right? And that sense of, you know, you feel, you know, when I'm lecturing in front of a big class of students, sometimes you can see the epiphanies going off, like literal light bulbs above people's head. You see, and there's this moment where they suddenly put a few things together and have this realization. You can see it on people's faces. And that's, I have to say selfishly, I live for those moments when I'm teaching, because, you know, that person has just had this kind of explosion of stuff go on in their head. And it's extraordinarily satisfying. And that's what art does. That's what science does. And that's why I love doing them both.
John Lennon said, you know, you got to turn me on, you know, that's you turning on light switches, and hopefully art and science both do that. So the one thing I discovered as an artist, when I became an artist, I thought an artist was somebody who goes into their studio and draws and paints. And yes, that is what an artist is. But I only really realized what an artist was when I left my studio and I went to interact with scientists, because that lack of control and discovery that only happens when you go in the world was so fascinating to me. And it made me realize that, oh, that's the art. That for me has become the real value of why I call myself this thing called an artist in the first place. Have either of you had a moment in your careers where you've realized, you know, because you get the label, and maybe you never got a label, Laura, because your trajectory was so circuitous, but, you know, at some point you thought, that's the artist, that there was an insight that you may have had or something that said, that's who I'm meant to be in the world, and that is the artist I'm meant to be. Does that resonate? And maybe even with you, Michael, as a scientist. So, Laura, does that question?
I think your identity is constantly shifting, at least for me, as you grow as a person and as you move through the world and you gain more knowledge and you become, you know, a bit more clever about things, or maybe more jaded, you know, either way. So, you know, for me, I have lots of little moments where I feel like I'm on top of the world because I'm loving what I'm doing. And it's when all those things are in synergy with each other that I feel like, I don't know what I am, an artist or a scientist. I just feel like I'm at the top of my, you know, mental capacity of things that I can do at that particular time. And, you know, it's a roller coaster. You can't sustain that all the time. So you sort of wait for those moments. That's kind of what makes, I think, being an artist really, really fun. It's like a treasure hunt for feeling that way.
You're after the buzz.
And the same is true. The same is true of science. It's a treasure hunt as well, right? It's going out and finding stuff, right? It's
just like collecting stuff to make assemblages.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing really in science.
And I mean, I think about being a paleontologist with, you know, a slab of shale, and you're peeling the time back, and suddenly you crack it open, and there, sitting in front of you, is this thing that no one has ever seen before, and it's 500 million years old. And you know, that's that moment. That's the kind of, that's the epiphany, that's the discovery, that's the stumbling on some. Oh, Tibor has just said, Michael, show us some of your work. Okay, I I can just show you one piece, I think. Here's a piece of ephemeral art from this year, which is at my house. I hope you can see that.
Absolutely can.
So rather than sweeping these things up and throwing them in the green bin, you can collect them, and you make something, and it gives you great joy and pleasure to make it, and then you look at it, and then the wind comes or it rains and it destroys it, and you let it go back, and eventually it becomes leaves on a paved courtyard again.
Can I tell you what I love about this work? Because you're a physical process in the universe that's evolved, and you've made this complex form that another physical process is just going to come along and undo, that's maybe slightly less evolved than you and has slightly darker ulterior motives than you. And I just love that interaction. You know, even that, like I get a buzz when I can tap into some sort of sciencey language to help me deal with that artwork. And, you know, seeing myself and you as a physical process is how I can unify all of it.
And also the other thing about this, Steve, is this is biological material made into a biological theme, into a schema that itself is informed by biology. Like it could be the tendrils of a fern, it could be the arms of an octopus, it could be any number of things. They could be sperm.
You've allowed the plant to reimagine itself as something else.
Yeah. And so anyway, Tibor, that's for you.
Thank you, Tibor.
So with work like that, it looks like it's not about the outcome as well. It's the process of making it.
Exactly.
You get out of that.
Yeah, it's the process, and once it's done, and you walk away.
Yeah.
And maybe no one, well, actually, you know, it's funny because probably the only people who saw it, other than you know, people who come and visit my house, were the guys that deliver gas to my LPG. And I just love the idea that they trundle down into this courtyard with their LPG line that they're going to fill my bottles with. And they look down at the ground and they go, WTF, what? You know, and I just love the idea that you know, probably they didn't even notice it, but hey, you know, who knows?
I think that there's always a role for artists being like guerrilla fighters, going into the cracks of society and making changes that.
Well, while you've been talking about, you know, art representing more than just what is there, I've been thinking about Banksy. Because, you know, if there's anyone who can put a girl in a pinafore and a balloon, it's a picture of a girl in a pinafore and a balloon, but it's so much more than that. You know, it's hope, it's wonder, it's potential loss of the balloon as it floats away in the helium. It's the fragility of life and of youth, and all of these metaphors are bound up, at least for me, in this image. Now, maybe for you, the metaphors that it evokes are completely different, but that's the point, is that everything, you know, it's doing something to you and telling you about yourself and about the world in a way that is fleeting and unplanned, and I don't know, it's awesome. Yeah.
It reminds me, like when you're talking about those cave paintings, can you imagine being those early artists who've been, you know, those early people, maybe they, having, you know, your life being like, imagine how much understanding was gained or some kind of handle on this world that they lived in when they were able to see the thing that lives out there suddenly appearing on their wall through their hands. And that's such a profound, you know, there's this video, they're actually terrible videos, but they're videos circulating out there of elephants painting, you know, but apparently they're very, very cruelly arrived at, you know, there's no feedback with the elephant going, I'm a pretty, or maybe there is, Tibor, maybe that responds to your point earlier, maybe the elephant's quite impressed with itself. But I think that it probably isn't. And I don't know if it has that moment of awareness when it's recognizing something out there through here. And I what, you know, it feels like, you know, I don't know, that's a quality of being human, that once you've had that spark of awareness, you know, you just want to keep going there, and you want to keep discovering all of that.
So for anyone who's listening at the moment, I know that they, you know, they get chimps and orangs and elephants to paint things. But if you want to see true aesthetic, have a look at Vogelkopf's bowerbird, Vogelkopf. And the males of this species make these, you can only describe them as kind of big cubby houses, and then they collect natural objects like bowerbirds do, but bowerbirds just collect them and scatter them around. Vogelkopf bowerbirds, each individual male has his own aesthetic and arranges these objects in different piles and moves them backwards and forwards. And it's said that, and of course it's all to attract a mate. And presumably the females go around and go, oh, that's an awesome thing right there. One of the things they do, you know on football fields how they have ads that are shaped like this on the ground, and when you look at them, they pop up in front of you as a 3D thing.
Oh,
It's said that Vogelkopf's bowerbirds actually invented that. So they put small things at the front and bigger things at the back, so that what happens when the female stands in front of it, it pops up in 3 dimensions, and the female is so bedazzled by this apparent visual illusion that she hangs around longer. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but just Google Vogelkopf's bowerbirds and you'll see that the aesthetic sense is not limited to humans, or at least I find these things aesthetic. Maybe the birds don't, maybe they're just doing random stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, and I guess they would evolve. You could argue that just evolves through natural selection, you know, but it does seem a little bit more compelling than that. Look, we've got 3 minutes left. We're going to have to wrap this up. I just, I think, are there any other questions? Hang on. Monica, a bowerbird lives in my garden, but he is not very talented, sadly. You need to speak to a bowerbird, Monica. But he is trying his best. Okay, we all are, all right? So far, lots of blue milk bottle caps. Well done. So there we go.
I feel bad if I was upstaged by a bowerbird. I'd be like, oh, I'm just going to give up.
That would be the worst. I just want to actually say, so look, this discussion, I've loved every minute of this. But what I've loved is because you're both so connected to the artist and the scientist in you. And I think for an audience, for the audience listening to this, yes, I think it's exactly right. You know, and I won't say our best selves, there's room for every kind of, you know, we need the scientists to go down deep and not worry about how the aesthetics. We need those artists to be sitting in there, you know, thinking deeply about notions that are only about their experience. But there is this cultural awakening, I actually think, where artists and scientists are recognizing. And I think artists have been actually going there for a while. Artists have been going into the sciences. And it's been amazing. And you know, slowly over time, it's going to just emerge as a cultural phenomenon. Scientists are going to become more aware of maybe that there is this kind of way. I know when I go to CSIRO, there's sometimes a slightly befuddled look as to what is this artist doing in our midst. But there's also those scientists that are actually really curious to know why I'm there and gain from the experience. Hopefully we both gain from the experience. So that's all I want to say. Do you want to say anything in parting? I just want to thank you both for joining us today. It was really a special afternoon.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Absolute pleasure, Steve. That was fascinating for me to hear all of that. I would say that many granting structures now are incorporating artists in residence for precisely this reason, that having an artist oversee what is being done in science gives you insights and ways of seeing that are beyond the standard kind of scientific notions. And it really does help you see things in a more creative and perhaps synoptic way.
Yeah, I think artists are really, they can take something from a science lab and ascertain its cultural significance. Because, you know, science doesn't give us meaning, it gives us an understanding, an objective one, but art gives us meaning. And so that's what art can do for science, is kind of fill that gap that science leaves us with as a species, as a humanity, to give us a direction forward. You know, where do we want to go? In the future, it's like we need to navigate this somehow and have a collective vision. And so, you know, art can help with that.
I'm not going to add, besides these words, any words on top of those words, because that is such a great way to end it. Thank you both, and just enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thank everyone else for joining us. It's greatly appreciated. Really valuable to have you all here. There's one more session tomorrow night at 8 o'clock where I'll be talking to a quantum physicist, Professor Sven Rother from UNSW, famous for the quantum computers there, and an artist who works with quantum data. Very interesting artist from UNSW School of Art and Design, Professor Paul Thomas. So I think it's going to be a very different conversation, and join us for that if you can. So thank you both to you. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.